Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be here. And it's great to be talking to you on the cusp of a brand new year. It's been a difficult year, as you all know better than anyone. Difficult economy, difficult for businesses, difficult for the clients you've been working with, and probably difficult for you. But the good news, I think, is that we're actually moving through this. And one of the ways to kind of think about how we're moving through this is that we're kind of at the beginning of a period, of essentially a transformational period, both in this country and around the world. And a lot of what we saw in the kind of financial crash and the slowdown of the global economy or the crash of the global economy is more like signs, symptoms of essentially a deeper, more fundamental restructuring that's going on, and that's going to play out for about the next 10 or 20 years. And that's what I want to really talk to you about today, is to understand the bigger picture, to understand the kind of long-term trends that are going on here, and to give you a better kind of strategic kind of vantage point on what's really going to happen next. Now, the way to understand this is that periodically the world, and most of the people here are Americans, but I'm going to take this a little bit more from a global perspective, but periodically, if you thought of it from American terms, there's been periods in American history or world history where you actually get such fundamental kind of forces for change that it prompts a very, very explosive period of innovation, essentially, that lasts about 10 or 20 years, where you essentially reinvent systems and actually that those systems then carry on for the long term. Now, these periods essentially are prompted, but the closer way to think of it is two fundamental things. One, you have deep structural changes to the economy or society. You know, we've seen it like going from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, or moving from rural living to urban living, that kind of fundamental reworking of what happens. Or what happens is you come up against a series of challenges that the old systems had no way to understand how to deal with. You know, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, certain things that our country and the world has had to face at other junctures. And then what happens is, because of this breakdown of the current systems, you watch this explosion of innovation, not just at government, but through the society in large, institutions, business, innovation, all kinds of different innovation that lasts about 10 or 20 years, and then the new system essentially gets set up that works for the long haul. Again, a great example is coming out of the Great Depression, World War II, we essentially built the post-war system that essentially, with the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the basic general way that we ran the global economy, and that's the system that we're still working with today. And so now that system's kind of breaking down. Now we're watching another kind of explosion of innovation, and I think this is kind of the way to think about what's going on today. Now, so the way to understand what's what's the fundamental thing that's going on today? Well, at one level, we're watching tectonic technology shifts. I mean, literally, the level of computerization, how those have started to now bit through every aspect of life and the economy, and also the kind of our telecommunications evolving. Think of it as the internet just getting to the point now where it's really starting to disrupt on a world historical kind of scale. The second thing that's happening is partly because of these technological drivers, but also because of the increasing interconnection of the world, we're essentially entering a new phase, I think, where you have to really be thinking almost beyond what we have been calling globalization. It's essentially the global reworking, the fundamental reorganization of the planet around global everything. And I think if people actually look back in 50 or 100 years' time or 200 years' time, they'll think, what the world did in the early part of the 21st century essentially is it went global. It got organized on a global planetary basis. I really think that's the fundamental restructuring that's going on today. At the same time, those kind of unprecedented challenges are coming up against us, things that we really haven't had to deal with. Climate change. There clearly is a climate change thing going on. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But there's a series, essentially, of 21st century challenges. There's a little push of our... But many of these challenges, because of this globalization particularly, we just don't know how to deal with. Global terrorism we're trying to figure out. Mass migration because of that. We're having to shift to new energies. There's all kind of things that are more domestic kind of oriented, like we got this baby boom retirement. What's going to happen with that? It's just breaking our old systems of kind of Social Security and old systems. They're just not capable of the 21st century demands. Anyhow, across the board, we're getting this. And this also works on a business sense. All this disruption at an economic and social level is also filtering through to basically changing the way we do business. And so whatever you think about it, whether you like change or not, we've got the good fortune, or we are in the position that we are living in this time of transition. We're living in a time of transition that fundamentally is going from a kind of world organized around national borders and national kind of ways of thinking about things to a much more interconnected global world. We're also moving from a world that essentially, and this is a longer-term play across this century, we're moving from a world that's based on, let's say, carbon energy sources to essentially one of more clean energy sources. Even if, not even driven by climate change reasons, we just know there's only so much oil and there's only so much, that is in the ground, about 30 years, they think, at most, maybe squeeze a little bit further. And so in this century, regardless of how urgently you're pressed by climate change, we're going to make this transition. It's going to be a very fundamental one that we're going to have to go through. And ultimately, we're going from a planet that's got 6 billion, close to 9 billion people is going to be by the middle of the century, going from some kind of system that doesn't seem sustainable to one that's got to be more sustainable. That's a transition we're going through. And then the kind of larger way to just to kind of think about it is we're essentially going from a 20th century way of doing things across the board into a much more 21st century way of doing things. And so what I'm going to do today is start to kind of wrap our hands around this kind of situation and give you essentially a look at 6, think of them as sub-transformations, in and of themselves, still very big things happening, but essentially that are really give you a more tangible way to understand the seismic or the monumental kind of shift that we're going through here. And what I want to do is I want to basically talk about technology, which the underlying driver of this, and give you some numbers and some understanding of really the forward motion that even though we think of our computerized, high-tech, interconnected internet society here as kind of what it's all about, we haven't really seen anything yet, and most of the world is barely just starting to experience this thing. So a lot of the implications of that are actually still ahead of us. I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of the economics of this, how we're actually creating this kind of global economy that actually has a lot of capacity for a lot of long-term growth going here, still going forward. Despite our kind of shakiness the last couple of years, all the fundamentals are there to pick up growth. Ultimately, we're going to talk, I do want to talk about this shift to clean energies, which I think is going to be a driver in any way, big new kind of frame that a lot of businesses are going to need to be focusing on. I'm going to also shift on another one that's very concrete and you can see very closely, is essentially the collapse of old media and the rise of the new. And that's a very dramatic example of how we're watching this system change happen in a very concrete set of industries, the media industries. I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics, particularly this next generation, the millennial generation, the younger generation that's going to populate this world in the next 50 years here, and the ones that you're going to have to tune into as employees and consumers from now on. And ultimately, I want to end here with something that's more pertains to your field of strategy consulting and things, because I think there's actually a new way we're going to start solving problems involving a lot larger numbers of people involved in the process than we have ever had before, partly from this technology. Now, it's a lot to cover. We're not going to basically go in depth in every one there, but we are going to basically give you enough of connecting the dots on things that you probably have heard about or seen about. Some of you might know a lot about it, but I think the overarching feeling of this presentation is to just give you a sense of the transformational kind of the transformation we're really within and how profoundly this is going to affect how you do business in the next 20 years here, or even 5, 10, 20 years.